On Tuesday, the Supreme Court is hearing a really important case. It's about access to abortion medication. This is just one of many high-profile and controversial cases the court is deciding this term.
This term is filled with huge cases with major consequences for the country, and the court just seems to be involved in every big issue of the day.
Anne Marimow writes about the Supreme Court for The Post.
Abortion, guns, former President Trump's liability. They decided on his ballot eligibility for the presidential election. And they're being pulled in all sorts of directions by the emergency docket, as we saw with the Texas immigration law.
Tuesday's case is about the abortion medication called mifepristone, one of two drugs used in medication abortions. The court's decision could restrict access to the drug. It's going to be hugely important how the court rules in this case and others. This is all happening at a time when there's less trust than ever in the Supreme Court and its ability to make reasoned, impartial judgments.
Public opinion polls in recent years have showed opinion of the court is at historic lows, hovering around 40%.
Anne finds it notable that at this time, two justices on opposite ends of the political spectrum have decided to talk with each other in public about where they find common ground and about the power of trust.
People's confidence that our branches of government can function means that our republic can function. And without it, we lose something very fundamental.
Justice Barrett.
Yes, I agree with Justice Sotomayor that confidence in institutions is important because it's institutions.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, March 25th. Today, the very public efforts by Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Amy Coney Barrett to restore credibility with the American public. Also, Anne breaks down the state of the Supreme Court and how they're approaching some of the thorny decisions before them. Anne spoke with my co-host Martine Powers, who first started asking her about the decline in public trust.
I'm curious if you have a sense of whether the members of the Supreme Court seem worried about that.
They're definitely hearing those concerns, and several of them have spoken out in public appearances, but also in their writings in the court. We saw Justice Elena Kagan, who's an Obama nominee, who last summer sort of echoed some of her concerns in her dissents, saying that the court has to act more like a court and to restrain itself and to do law instead of being seen as political and being seen as imposing their personal preferences. I think that when the court changed after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and had suddenly had this conservative supermajority and then quickly overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, ended race-conscious college admissions in the last term and got rid of Biden's student loan forgiveness program, all of those things in such quick succession, Kagan has commented, has led to some of these concerns.
I want to talk more later about some of the other ways in which the justices have been responding to some of these concerns about whether or not they're too partisan or that there's, this lack of trust in the court. But also, I just want to talk about the ways that they have made decisions in some of these recent cases. Because, as you said, the court now has a conservative supermajority, which you would assume would mean that basically everything is 6-3 or maybe sometimes 5-4, and that you have like the one set of justices on the one side, the other set of justices on the other side. But it seems like things have been shaking out in sometimes more complicated ways of late.
So often the court is unanimous. I think it's about 40-something% in the last few years. The court is often divided 6-3 on the cases that generate the big headlines on these most contentious issues that divide our country. But on other cases, there are often unusual coalitions. Just in the last week, we saw the 3 judges nominated by former President Trump align with the 3 liberal justices on a case about deportation and the standards that immigration judges have to use. So often on sort of issues involving the rights of criminal defendants, it doesn't line up 6-3.
And I was surprised, on the question of whether Trump could stay on the primary ballot in Colorado, the fact that it was a unanimous decision. And it's worth pointing out that there was some dissent in the reasoning or some kind of back and forth about, how did we get to this decision? But I did think that it kind of said something that all the justices were united in saying, actually, we believe that Trump in this scenario, should stay on the ballot. And that can't be perceived as a partisan decision.
I think the justices worked really hard on a question about presidential elections and qualifications for the ballot to be unanimous. And as you say, they were unanimous on the single issue of whether Colorado could kick a presidential candidate off the ballot. They said no. But then you saw the three liberal justices and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump nominee, saying that the rest of the court had gone too far by saying, here's how you enforce this disqualification clause. They said you didn't need to go there, that the majority had really gone too far and should have stopped at that first question.
And I've been really curious in some of your reporting that points out that Justice Amy Coney Barrett in particular has been kind of pushing the court to take a narrower approach on some of these decisions rather than making more sweeping decisions that kind of turn upside down the state of whatever, that there's been this push to make decisions in a way that it's a little bit more measured or targeted.
Yes, so on the very big controversial cases, she's been aligned with the conservative majority. But as you say, on these other cases, when it's possible, she has joined sort of more of the center of the court, which Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in being more moderate, looking for more narrow solutions, and also expressing herself and calling for comedy as she did in the Colorado case. And I could just read this one. She emphasized that on a case about politics and the presidential election, that in this circumstance, writings on the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. And she said, for the present purposes, our differences are far less important than our unanimity, and that all 9 justices agree on the outcome of this case. And that's the message that Americans should take home. I just thought it was striking that she was speaking directly to the public, sort of explaining, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
So at this point, would you call Justice Coney Barrett a moderate?
So in any case that involves abortion or affirmative action or the student loan program, she is with the conservative majority. I would say she is in the center of the court and more aligned with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh. That center, of course, is to the right at this moment.
And in terms of this idea of trying to turn the national temperature down, that's not only just happening in what Barrett has been writing in some of her opinions, but also in how she has been speaking directly with the public. You've been reporting on the fact that Barrett and also Justice Sonia Sotomayor have kind of been on the road a little bit together. They're going out, they're talking together, they have this friendship that they're excited to discuss with the public. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, they're not going too far out on the road. They're staying in D.C. mostly.
Okay,
but
sure.
No, but for 3 times, they've now appeared together. And the general theme has been, how can we disagree more agreeably, bridge differences, and even when we have really different viewpoints and opinions on these difficult issues, how can we do it in a way where we still like each other and have affection for each other? They did this in a Zoom during the pandemic where they were interviewed by a Yale law professor that they both know. They spoke to the National Governors Association meeting in D.C. And then just in the last 2 weeks, they participated in a civics education event where they were also interviewed about how they're really working to get along, even when they disagree.
And let's listen to a little bit of that tape.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. So this is Justice Sotomayor and Barrett on stage in D.C. In February, talking to the National Governors Association. And you hear Sotomayor talking about taking the temperature down.
There are so many, many things that you can do to bring the temperature down and to have you functioning together as a group to getting something done that has a benefit in the law. And so for me, Collegiality is at the center of our ability to work together, and to work together in a way where when we disagree, our pens are sharp, but on a personal level, we never translate that into our relationships with one another.
And at this moment, I think they knew how they were going to decide in the Colorado case. And so I feel like this kind of foreshadows what they ended up issuing in their opinion, which is Barrett and the liberals were saying, we only need to answer this one narrow question, and that can get us all to get along. And then, when they did release the opinion 10 days later, it was Barrett saying this is the time to turn the temperature down, not up. So I feel like they're sort of practicing what they're talking about there on stage.
And let's hear a little bit of Barrett, too, talking about some of this.
Justice O'Connor used to say, if you want to know what's going on in America, then you can look at our docket and you can see some of the battles that are being waged through litigation are often reflective of the battles that are being waged in the society at large. But I think if we demand of our institutions compromise, what if we started a campaign for compromise and a campaign for kindness and made clear that those are the kinds of things that we want to see in our civic institutions? I think we shouldn't underestimate the ability of the citizenry to demand that kind of change.
And this was at the National Forum of Civic Learning.
Yes, at George Washington University, sitting next to Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And what was really cool is they had recorded questions from high school students around the country, and they were asking, how do you deal with these difficult issues? And I thought that really reflected what's going on college campuses and school campuses, where students are really having trouble discussing these divisive issues and talking to people who have different opinions and getting along.
Mm-hmm. I find this dynamic so interesting. And I also want to say that I think a lot of cynical people, especially cynical liberal people, will be like, well, it's easy to call for compromise when you are Amy Coney Barrett siding in the majority in something like the Dobbs decision that, took away many people's right to abortion, and that when you're winning, it's easy to be like, oh, yeah, we should compromise more. But it does seem like this is coming from both sides. Sotomayor, who's to me, has taken over Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy as the liberal leader on the court, and the fact that they are talking about this together in this kind of united way does seem really surprising.
Yes. And you see these ongoing disagreements, even with the immigration case from last week out of Texas. Justice Sotomayor wrote a dissent that Justice Jackson joined. Very fiery, and saying that allowing this to take effect was going to cause chaos. And you had Barrett on the other side letting it go into effect. So yes, it is easy to call for comedy when you're on the winning side most of the time. But the two of them, as far as I can tell in these appearances, do seem to enjoy appearing together. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of it.
And what have they said about their personal relationship with each other and with the other members of the court?
Barrett likes to talk about small gestures that go a long way, and she talked about the first call that she got from the court after she was confirmed, actually still at the White House at the celebration.
And my cell phone rang. The very first call that I got from the court was from Justice Sotomayor calling to congratulate me and welcome me to the court.
And then at her very first day at the court, it was around Halloween time.
It had been a difficult few weeks. There were huge life changes. I didn't know how I would be received. Justice Sotomayor showed up in my office with Halloween candy for my kids, because it was right around Halloween time, for my husband to take back to Indiana with him when he went home that weekend.
So little personal things. And then they spend a lot of time together, just the 9 of them. They have these private conferences after arguments where they discuss their initial perceptions of the cases and take an initial vote.
What are these lunches? Where are they? When do you have them? And what do you all talk about?
So I don't know if we want to.
I won't share that. But we have
really
lunch.
Boring.
So the lunch is a routine of the court.
And then they have lunch together as well. And like school kids, they have assigned seats, and Justice Barrett and Sotomayor sit across the table from each other. They talk about family and books and not the cases, and really try to establish a rapport and relationship.
And I think it's a lot easier to demonize someone or to resent someone when you're not interacting with them in flesh and blood on a regular basis. Justice Sotomayor asks about how my children are doing, and she knows. When Justice Sotomayor's mother was dying, we all knew.
Barrett talked about these at their public appearances, how these small gestures go a long way.
After the break, Anne and Martine talk about whether these efforts can actually change how the public sees the Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
So it seems like these are two people who do genuinely enjoy each other in some ways and enjoy like serving as a model for what civic discussion can look like going forward. But at the same time, I mean, I wonder how much of this is just like a straight up PR campaign for the court, right? This is a moment where people aren't trusting the court for, I think, some pretty valid reasons, including questions of, whether certain justices are influenced by wealthy
billionaire friends.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yes. Speaking specifically of Clarence Thomas and the lack of an ethics code that people feel is being rigorously adhered to. So is Amy Coney Barrett and Sonia Sotomayor like going around talking to people about their friendship actually going to make a difference in terms of how people are viewing the court and the trustworthiness of their decision making?
I think it depends on who you're asking and depends on what case they're deciding on any given day. I do think the justices are aware of this perception and are responding to it. You saw all of the criticism from Democrats in Congress about the lack of an ethics code and concerns that Justice Thomas was accepting lavish gifts and trips from his billionaire friend and not reporting them. And then in November, the court did, for the first time, announce an ethics code that applies to the justices. So it does seem like they are responding in some small ways.
I think it's also notable that when we're talking about the relationship between Amy Coney Barrett and Sonia Sotomayor, that those are only two members of the court, right? And there are the more conservative members that I think a lot of people question, like, are they actually that concerned about how the court is viewed or like whether it's important to find more common ground, or like, are they not really on board with this mission?
I think all of them care about getting along. As Barrett repeated, there's a joke about the 9 justices. It's as if they're in an arranged marriage with no opportunity for divorce. And they all respect each other, that they're all in this common purpose and job together, interpreting the Constitution, and they all care passionately about it and think that they're all doing the best that they can. But I think there are some who are not as concerned about what the public thinks, and they just are happy to do their job and keep their heads down. But certainly Barrett and Sotomayor are not the only ones who are doing this. You had Justice Kagan and Justice Neil Gorsuch teaching a class together.
Oh, really?
Yes. And then famously, Justice Ginsburg and Scalia, were true friends and went to the opera together.
I keep hearing about the
vacation together.
opera
And then even Justice Kagan, when she first got in the court, went hunting with Justice Scalia. So there are other efforts to get along and just maybe not appear in person together.
But how much does that matter? Like, how much are we supposed to care about their personal relationships versus some of these questions around ethics and justices who seem to be like cherry-picked to make sure that they are deciding in certain ways when it comes to these most like controversial cases?
Yeah, those are all really big, important questions, and certainly the ethics code. And we'll be watching to see what the new financial disclosure forms look like and if those are being followed. But I think it is just worth noting that they are appearing together and trying to promote sort of collegiality while they disagree big time on these major cases.
I also just want to bring up briefly former Justice Stephen Brier, who was, as we know, replaced by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. But he has a book that's coming out in which he talks about 2 decisions that were made on the court very recently and kind of his thinking on those decisions, why he felt like the majority ultimately decided in the wrong. And to me, it seems like Justice Brier is like trying to speak to the current court from, this position of like having just been there. And I guess I'm wondering how much members of the court are listening to him.
Yeah, I think that the justices probably miss Justice Brier. I mean, he was one of the ones who had a really great relationship and rapport with the justices across the ideological spectrum and was somebody who walked the hallways, came into chambers to have informal conversations. And his book is really a continuance of what he was doing in his dissents in the decision to overturn Roe, and just how he interprets the Constitution, which is very different from the conservatives. And he's continuing to try to convince them to see that his way is the better way. He thinks that you shouldn't just look at the text in plain language. He thinks that the Constitution shouldn't be interpreted just how it was written at the beginning, and that you should consider the practical implications and what legislators were trying to do. So he's continuing to make that case and hoping his old colleagues pay attention.
So thinking about how there seem to be these different ways in which the court is trying to maybe either stake out more of a middle ground or at least limit the extent to which their decisions are seen as hyper-partisan? Or what are the cases in which you think that might be playing out in the coming term?
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how they rule in these social media cases. We've gotten one decision back that was unanimous, and that was a question of to what extent can public officials block critical voices from their Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts? And that really got started because of President Trump when he was trying to block commenters that he didn't like. And they issued a unanimous decision, set out some ground rules for when public officials can do this. So that's the place they found unanimity. On the flip side, last week with the Texas immigration law, the conservative majority let this very controversial, harsh immigration law from Texas take effect. We'll have more information after they hear the abortion pill case. That case won't take the pill off the market, but it could severely restrict access to the most widely used abortion medication.
So again, these issues that are sort of at the core of some of our biggest arguments as a country keep coming back to them, abortion and also guns, that they're looking at a gun case pretty soon that is pretty interesting. Can you kind of explain a little bit about this case and what are some of the implications of how they rule on that?
So there are two gun cases that have been considered this term, and we'll hear more before the term ends in June. The first is about whether the Second Amendment prevents the government from taking guns away from people who are under domestic violence restraining orders. So what are the gun rights of the people who are under those restraining orders? And the second is actually a Trump administration regulation banning bump stocks. This is the device that allows semi-automatic rifles to function more like a machine gun. And this was put in place after the mass shooting in Las Vegas at the outdoor festival.
And so what are kind of the notable questions around how they're going to rule on these? Or what are the questions that you have about how they're thinking about this subject?
Yeah, I didn't think in either case they didn't seem terribly sympathetic to the people under domestic violence restraining orders because they'd had some process in the courts that got to that point, a finding of dangerousness. And then on the bump stock question, there were several justices, I would say the majority, that seemed sort of skeptical that the government can't ban bump stocks when they essentially turn semi-automatic rifles into machine guns. So that's what we'll be watching for when they rule at the end of the term.
And what are some of the other big questions that you are thinking about as you watch these decisions roll in and as you take stock of like where the court is at right now and how they're thinking about this decision making?
Yeah, I think probably the most watched cases involve former President Trump and his immunity from prosecution and the timing of that decision and whether or not his trial in D.C. is going to go forward before the next presidential election. There's another big Trump case. It doesn't directly involve President Trump, but it's about the charges, the obstruction charges that are part of his case as well, brought by a defendant in the January 6th cases. So the court's going to decide whether that's a valid charge, and whatever they rule in that decision will also affect Trump's case in D.C. The other thing I'm watching is sort of how far this court goes, what they're willing to accept, for instance, from the conservative Fifth Circuit that brought them the Texas immigration case, challenges to the power of government agencies, and this abortion pill case. There's another case about access to emergency abortion care, and this is an effort the Biden administration made to preserve sort of a narrow window of access, saying that even in states that have strict abortion bans, if a woman comes and her life is in danger, the abortion has to be performed because of a Medicare law. We're talking about how the justices themselves are getting along behind closed doors, but at the end of the day, these are huge decisions that affect all of our lives in so many ways.
Anne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anne Marimow writes about the Supreme Court for The Post. She spoke with my co-host, Martine Powers. If you want to tune in live tomorrow as the Supreme Court hears oral arguments in the Mifepristone case, we'll be carrying that at WashingtonPost.com and on our YouTube channel, along with analysis from Washington Post journalists and legal experts about the implications of this decision. If you want to tune in, the live show starts at 9:30 a.m. Eastern on Tuesday. We'll share a link to it in our show notes. We'll also link to a story from our colleague Caroline Kitchener about the sharp increase in the use of abortion pills outside of the medical system. There's also one other story we're following today. The United Nations Security Council passed its first resolution calling for a ceasefire in Israel's war in Gaza. The resolution demands an immediate ceasefire during Ramadan and a release of all hostages held in Gaza. The U.S. abstained from the vote, which allowed it to pass. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters that the abstention did not represent a change in U.S. policy on the war. In response, Israel's President Benjamin Netanyahu canceled plans for a high-level Israeli delegation to visit the U.S. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Lucy Perkins and Monica Campbell. Thanks to Debbie Wilgorn and Peter Bresnan. If you love our show, you can help other people discover it in a very easy way. Just leave a rating on Spotify or a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.